Welcome to the Betterment Lectures. My name is Dr. Dorian Miners, and if there's one thing I've learned as a brain scientist, it's that there's no instruction manual for this device in our head. But there are patterns of thought, patterns of feeling, patterns of action, because that's what brains do. So let me teach you about them. One pattern, one podcast, and you see if it works for you. Now, the last few episodes have been a kind of pop neuroscience debunking run. So I covered the amygdala, covered cognitive bias, covered how people use neuroscience to over-engineer calming down. So I wanted to do something a little bit different from the brain science today. I wanted to talk about something a bit more social, a bit more interesting maybe for people who aren't into brain science, and a bit more structural. And something that I think a lot of people are getting wrong in a way that's starting to have real consequences and no good solutions. Now, before I was at Sandhurst, before I was a brain scientist even, I was a clinician, a crisis counsellor. And one of the things I would deal with a lot was people's digital hygiene, techno-stress, as it seems to be getting called these days in academic circuits. And it's the idea that people are struggling with their digital habits or their screen time management or doom scrolling or whatever people are calling it now. And I think that we all have this distinct sense that the digital world is a perilous place, this economy of shame, outrage, yearning and terror that floods our media streams, these algorithms that are designed to suck us in and drain us dry, algorithms that famously the creators won't use themselves or let their kids use. And so I want to talk about it because I think that the social media problem is actually a bit of a distraction. So let's get into it. So here's the story that you've probably heard. Mental health problems are on the rise, particularly in young people. Social media use is also on the rise. So probably social media is causing the mental health crisis. And there are some fun sort of graphs around this. So you see social media use starting to tick upwards in around 2010. And at around the same time, you have this spike in mental health concerns. So ipso facto, et cetera, social media, mental health concerns, it's hard not to draw that conclusion. And it's hard not to draw that conclusion because it feels right. And you've probably felt it yourself, doom scrolling at midnight, closing the app, feeling worse than when you opened it. I remember distinctly in the final hours of my PhD, the final couple of weeks, I would finish up a day of writing at 4 a.m, and I was sort of perversely addicted to watching car crash reels on Instagram until the sun rose. Try getting a good night's sleep for the next day of writing after that. So these things, or watching your kids or someone else's kids glued to their phones or their iPads in a way that just seems unhealthy. I think there was that, it was a Tumblr post that said if aliens came to Earth, they would think that we were the slaves of the little black boxes we carried around in our hands while we were sitting or walking or even driving our cars. I think we're all familiar with this problem, and there is a figurehead for this problem now. That sense that social media is causing all of these concerns. And it's Jonathan Haidt, who is a social psychologist who pivoted through some excellent work on moral psychology in the early 2000s. Stuff actually that I teach in my classes today. And then into some slightly more questionable complaints about how emotionally fragile our society is becoming these days. And then more recently has published a book called The Anxious Generation. And it sold over 2 million copies, spent a year on the bestseller list. It's very popular. And it makes this argument. And the argument is that smartphones have rewired children's brains. And this is a problem because we evolved for a play-based childhood and we've replaced it now with screens. And so the thesis is that we can't handle this new world of social media. Our brains aren't adapted for the technology. And apparently directly off the back of this book and certainly the broader anxiety it represents, 35 US states have passed phone restriction legislation. And Australia, dearer to my heart, has banned social media for under 16s. And other countries are now considering doing the same thing. There's essentially this very mainstream craze around forcing people to do less social media. And I should say that the concern is very understandable. Social media companies aren't really benevolent creatures, and the algorithms are explicitly designed to hold your attention. So it's very easy to look at TikTok or Instagram and think, that can't be good for a 14-year-old. But understandable isn't the same as correct. And I've been writing about this for a while now, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but essentially pointing out that the research doesn't really support this story. And maybe more pressingly, everyone has been writing and podcasting about how Haidt seems to have got himself caught up in this sort of increasingly shrill moral panic about the problem. And what's good is that since I wrote my article, the research has moved on quite a bit. So today, I basically want to do a little update. And we'll do that by starting with what the research actually says, because the gap between the public narrative and the scientific evidence is kind of troubling. So in 2024, Christopher Ferguson published this meta-analysis of 46 studies looking at the social media use of youths and mental health. And a meta-analysis is an analysis that collects studies that look at this phenomenon and then looks at the trends across the studies. So he took 46 studies, looked across them, and what he found is that the effect of social media use on mental health was not statistically different from zero. Now, that's not the same thing as small. That's academic speak for nothing, right? And there's two forms of nothing that academics can talk about, and I'll link to something on this in the show notes. But essentially, you can have no evidence for something because we haven't actually looked yet, and you can have no evidence for something because we've looked and we couldn't find any evidence. And here he's saying the latter. He's saying that there is no evidence. I looked across 46 studies and I didn't find any evidence. And in that paper, kind of presciently, he explicitly warned that policymakers and professional guilds, psychology bodies, medical associations, these people are misleading parents with these unsupportable claims about the harms of social media. Now, that same year, Amy Orben's group, she runs a lab at my old department at the University of Cambridge that basically does nothing but study this exact question. So her group published the biggest meta-analysis yet, 143 studies with over 1 million adolescents collectively. And she found that the correlation between social media use and mental health problems was at 0.08. So that's the relationship between the two. How much does the change in one explain the change in the other? How much does a change in social media use predict a change in mental health problems? And it was at 0.08. And for context, a correlation of 0.08 is almost indistinguishable from zero. If you put it in percentage points, where a correlation coefficient of 1 is 100%, it means that social media use explains less than 1%, right? 0.8% of the variation in mental health outcomes, less than 1%. So all of that happened in 2024 when I first wrote the article on the subject. Now, more recently, an umbrella review came out covering 72 reviews, including 20 meta-analyses. So meta-analyses looks at trends across studies. This umbrella review looked at the trends across studies and the meta-analyses of studies. And what they found is that general social media use showed, and I'll quote here, weak and inconsistent associations with mental health. The only thing that was consistently associated with worse outcomes was what they called problematic use. Essentially, what they're looking at is addiction pattern behavior. So not using social media, but being addicted to social media, which is a very and importantly different claim. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I want to tease out what's happening here a bit first. Now, Stuart Ritchie, who wrote a fantastic book called Science Fictions, I really recommend it, he makes this excellent point about why the research looks like this. Basically, people claiming that social media is causing problems are sort of cherry picking. They're counting studies that favour their hypothesis that social media is bad. And the problem there is that in science, you can't just count studies, because 20 tiny, low-quality studies saying that X is true can't outweigh one large, well-designed study saying that it is not true. Because science isn't a democracy where one study gets one vote. It's the methodology that really matters. And that basically seems to have happened here. You have a lot of low-quality correlational work that seems to point in one direction, but it's drowned out by the careful studies that don't find much of anything. And yet, 35 US states legislated on this evidence base, and Australia banned under 16s. And if you listen to my lecture on atavism just a couple of podcasts ago, you'll recognize this pattern, right? Where people got scared of technology, they noticed that there's a problem, they blamed the modern world because there's something that's going wrong. And the obvious solution is to go back to the old ways, right? To ban the modern problem, to eliminate it. And this panic led to policy. And the problem is left completely unresolved because atavism is almost never the answer. People aren't defenseless against the modern world. What it requires is just a little bit of thought. So what I want to do now with you is a little bit of thought. So the question then becomes, if it's not social media that's causing the problem here, because mental health problems are actually going up, then what is going on? And there's an important answer that I'm not really going to speak to here, which is the quality of our testing for mental well-being. And I'll find something to link to on this in the show notes. But one of the things that's definitely happening is we're spending more time diagnosing people with mental illness and spending more effort as a society treating these people with care. So that accounts for part of it, but sadly it doesn't account for everything. And so I did a fun kind of exercise for, well, fun or depressing, you decide, for the article version of this lecture. And basically what I did was walk through the top level headings on contributing factors to mental illness in my first year psychopathology textbook from about a decade ago. And I checked to see which ones have gone up. And what I found is that nearly every single one has. And I'll give you a few of them just to illustrate. So the first one is income inequality and the cost of living. And this one's pretty hard to miss if you're online at all. Widening income inequality is pretty well documented across most developed countries. And there's this very clear empirical correlation between more inequality and more mental health problems, depression and anxiety, mood disorders mostly. And there's this paper in The Lancet in 2023 that modeled the health effects of the cost of living crisis and found it threatens, as you'd expect, both physical and mental health, and does so disproportionately for vulnerable households. And in particular, what's gotten worse is housing. So this Dutch longitudinal study found that housing unaffordability increased sharply, almost entirely within the rental sector, and that is clearly linked to poorer mental health, particularly in younger adults. So if you're under 35, like me, and you're renting, then you're the demographic being squeezed the hardest, and the mental health data shows it. The next heading was job insecurity and, the gig economy, 0-hour contracts, short-term contracts. I think it's pretty clear that work is changing and it's turning ever more towards instability. And I think a charitable interpretation is that we are turning towards flexibility, and that's also true. But flexibility is definitely a trade-off with stability. And just looking at, the rate of striking in the UK over wages and working conditions over the last few years, you've got pretty good anecdotal evidence that something's off with regard to job security. And the correlation between job insecurity and psychological distress is one of the most robust in the occupational health literature. Another heading was urbanization. So more people live in cities than ever before, and several studies highlight the correlation between urban living and higher stress, social isolation, mental health disorders, because city living is just hard on people, even with all the advantages that it confers over living more rurally. One of the more interesting or less predictable headings was information overload. And now this one does involve social media, but not in the way that Jonathan Haidt and people like him would have you believe. Because it's not that Instagram is rewiring your brain. It's that the sheer volume of information that we're all processing is just completely unprecedented. And not only that, but it's on the increase. And there's this book by a guy called Neil Postman. He wrote it in the 80s that was very famous, and I think it's still well worth a read today. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I'll link to an article, one of my articles on that book in the show notes. But what he said, in short, is that the problem here is that in a technologically connected world, rather than getting information about your local area, people and places and events that you can engage with and do something about, more and more we're now getting information from nowhere and to no one, as he calls it. And you can't do anything about these things. Right, you can't do anything about the war in Ukraine, but you're fed information about it. You can't do anything about the situation in Iran, but you're fed information about it. And Neil Postman was talking about television, but the internet obviously made that problem much, much more poignant. Another heading was sedentary lifestyles. You know, we've been agonizing over this since the 70s, and it's only getting worse. And I could keep going. Right? Substance misuse, climate anxiety, family dynamics. I mean, I just wrote an article on how much cultural turmoil is happening around family dynamics. Almost all of the headings from this textbook seem to be problems that have been increasing in recent years. And when you lay all of this stuff out, social media just becomes this tiny thread in this much bigger tapestry of problems. And in fact, a really comprehensive review came out just last year that argued this. They call it, and I'll quote, a paradigm shift in the global political economy, which has largely passed under the radar. They're basically saying that these sort of neoliberal policies have produced this fragmentation and inequality, and that this is what's driving the youth mental health crisis. Social media is just one item in a long list of contributing factors. Nowhere, I should point out, near the headline. And the most authoritative review I've found on the subject, an article published in World Psychiatry in 2024, is a comprehensive treatment of the social determinants of mental health. So they look at income, housing, neighborhood, education, employment, discrimination. They complain about all of these problems, but what's important about them is that all of these things are structural or really complicated problems to solve, and all far outshadowing the effect of social media. You know, I titled the article that I wrote on this, "It's not social media, life is just worse." And in many ways, that really seems to be the problem. And if that's true, right, and it seems to be true, then I think that we can look at social media a little bit differently. And this is something that I speculated about in my original article, but there's actually data behind this. It's a question, and the question is social media making people sad? Or is it that sad people are using more social media? And when I wrote the article, I was asking this question because all of the research is trying to do work that associates increased social media use with mental health concerns. A correlation, as I said, it describes a relationship where when one goes up, what is the other one doing? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying the same? And with any study that's just correlational, that just looks at the association between the two, the relationship, if it's a real relationship and not just a coincidence or something, the relationship could go both ways. Social media could be doing what Jonathan Haidt thinks it's doing, making people worse, rewiring their brains and causing more mental health concerns. But since the literature doesn't really seem to pan out on this one, maybe it's going the other way. Maybe it's that people with mental health concerns are doing something differently with social media. Now, Amy Orben, again, a lab lead in my old department at Cambridge, her group published another paper in Nature Human Behavior last year. And this was a registered report, which means that they described the methodology, and that methodology got peer-reviewed before they collected the data. And the reason that's important is because recently, over the last 15 years, we've run into this problem called the replication crisis. And what that refers to is the fact that a lot of the famous psychology studies, almost all of them, in fact, can't be replicated. They were done once, and now when people try and do that exact same study again, they're not finding the same result. And there are a few reasons for this, but one of the reasons is because what people will do is they would have an idea, they'll collect the data around that idea, they'll run whatever methodology they had planned on the data to try and find the result. And they won't find the result that they wanted to find. So then they'll go and start messing about with the data until they find something that supports the finding that they wanted to discover. And obviously, it's difficult to replicate this process when you come to do it again because it is fraud, right? So one of the solutions that scientists are now doing is that they're registering their methodology, having the methodology peer-reviewed, and then collecting the data, running the methodology exactly as they said they would, and as a consequence, there's much less risk of this kind of messing around. So that's what Amy Orben's group did. They registered their report and looked at a nationally representative UK sample of over 3,000 adolescents and conducted a bunch of proper clinical assessments on them. And what they found is that adolescents who already have mental health conditions spend more time on social media. They do more social comparison. They are more affected by feedback on their posts. And so what you're seeing is that the kids who are already struggling are the heaviest users. There's this other Spanish study that found the same pattern from another direction, because what they found was escapism as a motivation for using social media predicted more internalizing symptoms, which is it's what we call it when you direct your sort of psychological distress inwards. So anxiety, depression, withdrawal, somatic complaints like headaches or stomach aches with no medical cause. All of these things we call internalizing. And we call it internalizing because it's in contrast with externalizing, where you turn your psychological distress outwards, so aggression or rule breaking or substance use. So back to the study, escapism as a motivation for using social media predicted more of these kinds of internalizing symptoms, more of these kinds of mood problems, somatic complaints, and so on, which in turn predicted more social media use. Basically a reinforcement loop or a vicious cycle. But the starting point for the cycle was the psychological distress itself, that motivation to escape, not the social media platforms. And remember, when I was talking about the problem with association studies, correlation studies, where you can't tell which is the one influencing the other, does social media cause people to feel bad, or does feeling bad cause people to use more social media? Or is it a coincidence? There's always the possibility that there's some third thing that's causing the change, something that influences both social media and mental health concerns. It's not that one of those things causes the other. So the solution to figuring out what is going on here is a causal study where you actually look at the cause. And I won't get into the detail of how you go about that for time, since we're already getting on a little bit. But there's this one big UK longitudinal study, a study that looked at people over time, that I think is quite interesting, because it found very little evidence for a causal relationship between social media use and mental health problems over the course of the 2 years the study was run, because most of the apparent effect was mediated by self-esteem. And when you controlled for self-esteem, the relationship between social media and mental health concerns washed out. So self-esteem seemed to be the thing causing things, increasing their mental health concerns, increasing their use of social media. So all of this paints this really clear picture. And, you might put it like this, that social media seems like it's acting as something closer to a thermometer. It's acting like a measure of the problem. And to kill the the metaphor I've introduced, smashing the thermometer isn't really likely to do anything about the weather, right? When we find kids on TikTok who are sad, maybe they're on TikTok because they're sad. Maybe social media is the most visible manifestation of people trying to cope with a world that is, in all these structural ways I've just described, getting harder to live in. So I guess what I should probably do now is talk about what we can do about it. So I'll do a little bit of that and then I will let you go. So what does all of this mean for you, right? All these studies, all this technical detail. I think three things. I think the first thing is that we should probably be a bit more honest about why we feel this impulse to scapegoat the screen time. Because the structural factors that I've been describing, the inequality, the housing, the job insecurity, the urbanization, the information overload, and so on and so forth, these things are enormous and slow-moving and politically inconvenient problems. You can't fix income inequality in the legislative session. You can't reverse urbanization with a policy paper, right? Not in the least because it doesn't really serve politicians to do so. But you can ban phones in schools. You certainly can pass an age restriction on social media. You can do these things that are visible, have an impact on individuals, and as a result, it feels like we're doing something. And again, it's this pattern I talked about in the Atavism lecture. We have these legitimate concerns about the modern world, and we have these real yearnings for an idyllic past. But because we don't work like that, and because the past was never as uncomplicated as we like to make out, we end up in this situation where we have the wrong diagnosis and the wrong prescription for the problem. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, this isn't a lecture about social media being harmless, because it's certainly not nothing. But what the research is increasingly clear about is that what you do on social media matters much more than how long we're spending on social media. Passive consumption of weight loss content is associated with body image problems. But active social use, where you're talking to friends and maintaining relationships, can actually be a protective factor. There's this really nice review in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry that said, and I'll quote, "Social media use is not a monolith," right? It's not all the same thing. It's more like a diet where the question isn't whether you're eating, it's what you're eating. And then the third thing, and I think that this is the bit that matters most, is that it's up to you to shape your relationship with social media, not the other way around. As far as anyone can tell from the evidence we have, social media isn't actually doing something to you. You're doing something with social media, and the thing that you're doing with it is shaped by everything else going on in your life. So if your life is good, if you've got stable housing and decent work and people around you that actually care about you, then social media and your use of it is probably going to be just fine. But if your life is hard, social media might be where you're going to cope. And it might not always be the healthiest coping strategy. But the answer to that isn't taking away the coping strategy. The answer is probably to fix the thing that's making life hard. And that, honestly, seems like a pretty good place to leave it. Until next time.